Galactic Empire panics. That can't be a human warship. The first sign of trouble was not a weapon, it was a number. Senior analyst Asa was halfway through a cold meal at her desk when the number appeared on her screen. It was a velocity reading from the outer sensor grid, Corridor 9 deep monitoring zone, rarely used, rarely checked. The number made no sense. She put down her fork and looked at it again. It had not changed. She ran the diagnostic twice. The sensors were working fine. The number was real. Whatever was moving through Corridor 9 was doing so at a speed that should not be possible for any object with physical mass. Not a scout ship, not a missile, not a full drive burst. Something was simply traveling faster than the Voth Dominion's best warships could manage at full burn, and it was doing so without any drive signature Asa could identify. No plasma trail, no gravity well distortion, no ion scatter, nothing. She flagged it and sent it up the chain. The automated system tagged it as a probable sensor fault and routed it to maintenance. Asa stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork, put it back down, and manually escalated the report to Patrol Command herself. 6 patrol ships reached Corridor 9 2 hours and 40 minutes later. Their commander, a veteran officer named Dren, had handled sensor ghosts before. He expected to find nothing. Instead, he found a ship. Dren's first transmission back to command was professional and controlled. His second was neither. The object ahead of his patrol was not in any database. Its hull was a color that did not match any registered alloy on record, a deep, almost black material that absorbed scanner pulses and returned almost nothing useful. It was large. Not large like a freighter. Large in a way that made Dren's ships feel like they were approaching a moving continent. It carried no identification markings, no transponder signal, no hailing frequency was acknowledged. Dren followed protocol. He broadcast on all standard frequencies, Voth diplomatic, Voth military, universal emergency band. Nothing. He activated weapons lock, which was both a targeting action and a formal warning signal recognized by every known spacefaring species. The ship did not slow, did not turn, did not acknowledge in any way. It continued on its heading like Dren's patrol did not exist. He fired warning shots, precise, visible, impossible to miss. Energy bolts that lit up the dark between them like small suns. The ship did not react. It passed through the dissipating light of the warning fire and kept moving. Dren requested emergency backup and attempted a boarding intercept. He sent 2 craft forward on a standard approach vector, moving to match speed with the object's hull. The boarding craft were not fired upon. They were not threatened. A field of some kind, invisible, frictionless, completely unidentifiable, simply redirected them. Gently. The way a person moves a cup off a table to make room for something more important. The object continued on its heading, straight toward the Voth Dominion's capital sector. Back at the intelligence station, Asa was no longer eating. She had pulled every file the Dominion had on ships matching the approximate size class, hull geometry, and drive signature. There were no matches. She widened the search to include theoretical designs, things that had been modeled but never built. Still nothing. She tried a different approach. She took the heading the object was traveling and worked backward, calculating origin vectors. The line pointed to a region of space at the edge of Dominion-surveyed territory. A quiet region. No major systems. No known powers. A handful of minor species listed as pre-interstellar or early-stage development. She filtered the list down by estimated technological capability. Then she filtered it further by hull geometry approximations from Dren's sensor data, looking for any species known to use dark absorption hull materials. One match came back. A single file, 400 years old, a scout report from the early survey era. The species was small in number at the time of contact, confined to a single planet, early industrial, no space travel, no threat assessment above Category 0. The file was 3 pages long. The scout had not been impressed. Asa read the species name twice. She had never heard anyone say it aloud in a professional context. It appeared in textbooks only as a footnote example of why routine cataloging was important. Humanity. She sat back in her chair and looked at the sensor feed showing Dren's patrol falling behind the object, unable to match its speed even at maximum burn. She thought about the boarding craft being moved aside like toys. She thought about the warning shots passing through that dark, impossible hull glow with no effect whatsoever. Then she opened a new file and began to write the fastest intelligence summary of her career. At the bottom, in the threat classification field, she left the cursor blinking for a long time before she typed anything at all. Galactic Empire panics. That can't be a human warship. There is a particular kind of silence that falls in a war room when the people inside it do not have an answer. Grand Warlord Drath knew that silence well. He had caused it many times in other people's rooms. He had never expected to experience it in his own. The display at the center of the room showed the object in real time. It was still moving. It had not slowed. His senior staff stood around the table with the careful, rigid posture of officers who were thinking very hard and saying very little because they did not want to be the first to admit they had nothing useful to offer. Drath looked at the object on the display, then he looked at his fleet commander. "Options," he said. Fleet Commander Raven gave him 4. Intercept with heavy class vessels. Attempt a communications override on all known frequency bands. Deploy a shadow fleet and track without engagement. Or wait. Drath chose the intercept. 47 vessels, the heaviest class in the Dominion fleet. Ships that had ended wars and broken planetary sieges. Ships that, when they moved together, blocked out the light of nearby stars on long-range optical sensors. He ordered them into a full blockade formation across the object's projected heading. The fleet took position. The formation was textbook. Overlapping fields of fire, layered defensive screens, communications blackout to prevent signal interception. Raven reported the fleet was ready. Every weapon system live. Every shield at full power. The object did not slow. Drath watched it approach the blockade on the display. For a moment he thought it might stop. It seemed, for just a few seconds, like it might finally acknowledge what was in front of it. Then it hit the formation. Not with weapons, not with a collision. The 47 ships were displaced from their positions the way water moves around a stone dropped into a pool. The force fields that pushed them were unlike anything in Voth engineering, smooth, precise, non-destructive. Not a single vessel was damaged. Not a single crew member was harmed. They were simply moved aside, and the object continued through the space where the blockade had been, still on the same heading, still at the same speed. The war room was very quiet. Raven's voice, when it came over the channel, was tight and flat. He said his ships were intact. He said there were no casualties. He said he had no idea what had just happened. Asa was in the room by then. She had been brought in after her intelligence summary circulated to the upper levels in record time. She stood near the back wall and watched the display and did not speak unless spoken to. When Drath finally turned to her and asked what she knew, she told him everything she had. The species name, the old scout file, the origin region, the fact that the Dominion had not looked at that region seriously in 4 centuries. Drath asked her what their current threat classification was. Asa said the file still listed them as Category 0. Drath looked at the display, where his 47 ships were slowly reforming their scattered positions, and said nothing. It was a junior diplomatic officer named Cruel who suggested trying the registered contact frequency. He said it quietly, from a side console, and several people looked at him like he had said something embarrassing. But Drath told him to do it. The registered frequency for the species was old and barely used, more of a formality than a real communications line, a courtesy notation from the first survey period. Cruel opened the channel and stated the standard Voth diplomatic identification sequence. He expected no response. He got one inside 8 seconds. The voice was calm. It spoke in clean, functional Voth standard, not accented, not hesitant. It identified itself as a representative of the human administrative authority and asked, politely, whether the Dominion had a concern it wished to raise. Cruel looked at Drath. Drath gave him a very small nod. Cruel said that the Dominion required the vessel currently transiting its sovereign space to halt immediately and submit to identification procedures. There was a short pause. Then the voice said, in the same calm tone, that the vessel was operating within its assigned mission parameters and was not in violation of any boundary. It asked whether the Dominion had a specific grievance to register or whether this was a general inquiry. Drath reached over and took the communicator from Cruel. He said, clearly and without diplomatic softening, that the ship would stop or it would be destroyed. The pause this time was slightly longer. The voice said, "We would prefer not to have that conversation. Is there something we can help you with?" Drath set the communicator down. He looked at the display. The object was still moving, still on its heading, still completely unconcerned with everything the Dominion had done or said. Ravin quietly asked whether Drath wanted a second military response prepared. Drath said yes. Then he looked at Asa and asked her to find everything the Dominion had ever recorded about this species, every survey note, every patrol log, every automated sensor sweep that had ever touched that region of space. He wanted it all reviewed and on his desk. Asa said she would start immediately. She turned to leave. At the door she paused and looked back at the display one more time. The object had not slowed. It had not wavered. It moved with the complete and total confidence of something that had never once considered the possibility of being stopped. She left quickly. She had a great deal of work to do, and she suspected that what she found was not going to make the Grand Warlord's night any easier. Galactic Empire panics. That can't be a human warship. Deep in the Dominion's archive network, there was a section that no one visited. It was not classified. It was not restricted. It was simply ignored, the way a drawer full of old receipts is ignored, technically organized, technically accessible, practically forgotten by everyone with anything better to do. Asa found it at the 3rd hour of her search, when every other avenue had run dry. The section was labeled Early Survey Candidates Species Status, Dormant Review. There were 912 files in it. She sorted by origin coordinate and found humanity's entry near the bottom. File number 7 Theta 04. Last updated 401 years ago. The update had been automatic, a system flag that triggered whenever a dormant file went more than a century without a manual review. Someone had cleared the flag without opening the file. The timestamp showed it had taken them 11 seconds. Asa opened the file. The original scout report was brief. 2 pages of field notes, written in the clipped shorthand of a survey officer with too many systems to cover and too little time. The planet was described as habitable, temperate, resource-rich. The species was described as bipedal, land-dominant, pre-spaceflight, showing early signs of industrial chemistry and internal combustion propulsion. Population at time of survey, approximately 4 billion. Social structure, fragmented, multinational, historically conflict-prone. Technological trajectory, slow. Projected spaceflight capability, 3 to 5 centuries. Recommended action, passive monitoring, revisit in 200 years. No one had revisited. Asa moved past the scout report and looked for anything added after the initial survey. She found 2 items. They were not reports. They were incoming communications, transmissions received by the Dominion's outer relay stations from the registered contact frequency for the human territory. Both had been received, logged, and assigned to the diplomatic intake queue. Neither had been acted on. The first transmission was 112 years old. It was a formal request for trade dialogue and mutual recognition, written in a careful, slightly awkward version of Voth standard. the kind of language produced by someone who had learned it from old documents rather than living speakers. It referenced the original survey contact as the basis for the outreach and expressed interest in establishing regular communication. The intake officer who had tagged it wrote a single note in the margin: low priority species, no strategic value, queue for standard delay response. There was no record of the response ever being sent. The second transmission was 63 years old. It was different in tone, more formal, more precise, and written in a much cleaner version of Voth standard. It was a legal notice. It cited Galactic Territorial Convention, Section 7, Paragraph 4, which required spacefaring species to formally notify neighboring powers when establishing sovereign territorial claims beyond their origin system. The humans were notifying the Dominion, in writing, with full coordinate listings, that they were claiming sovereign jurisdiction over a defined volume of space. Asa pulled up the coordinates and fed them into the navigation system. The result took a moment to render. When it did, she sat very still and looked at it for a long time. The territory the humans had claimed 63 years ago, the territory they had formally, legally, properly notified the Dominion about, in a transmission that had been received and never answered, was enormous. It was not a handful of systems around a home planet. It was a region of space that, when overlaid on the Dominion map, covered an area nearly equal to a third of the Dominion's own sovereign territory. Hundreds of star systems. An entire arm of the local galactic structure, quietly and formally claimed, with the paperwork filed and ignored. And somewhere in that space, based on the patrol reports she had cross-referenced, were 17 more ships. At minimum, the same class as the one currently pushing through Dominion fleets like they were made of mist. Asa wrote up a secondary report and flagged it urgent. Then she kept digging. She found the survey team logs next. Over the past 4 decades, the Dominion had operated 14 active survey and patrol teams in the outer territories, including regions that now appeared to sit squarely inside the human-claimed boundary. She pulled their logs. She searched for any notation of contact, construction, habitation, or anomalous activity. She found 42 entries marked anomalous construction signatures, probable geological. She opened the first one. The attached sensor imagery showed what the survey officer had interpreted as natural crystalline formations on an uninhabited moon. Asa stared at the image. The formations were arranged in precise rows. They had power conduits running between them. 3 of them had what appeared to be atmospheric processing units attached to their bases. Those were not geological formations. Those were buildings. She opened another entry, and another. By the 7th one, she stopped opening them and simply counted. 42 instances of human infrastructure, logged and misclassified as geology, sitting in Dominion patrol records going back 30 years. The humans had been there quietly for decades, building, expanding, saying nothing because they had already said what needed to be said 63 years ago, and the Dominion had not answered. Asa finished her report at the 5th hour. It was the longest document she had ever written. She sent it to Drath's office with a priority flag and sat in the empty archive room for a while, looking at the territorial overlay on the display. The human ship was still moving. She could see its tracker on the side panel, still the same heading, still the same speed, completely unhurried, like something that had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove to anyone. She thought about that second transmission, 63 years old, written in perfect legal Voth standard, filed correctly, properly addressed, every box checked, and then set on a queue and left there like a bill no one wanted to pay. She wondered if the humans had expected an answer. She suspected they had known they would not get one. She suspected, sitting there in the dark and quiet of the archive room, that they had built accordingly. Galactic Empire panics. That can't be a human warship. The boarding drone came back folded. Not destroyed, not melted, folded carefully, precisely, along lines that should not have existed in its metal frame, like a piece of paper creased into a shape by someone with very steady hands and a great deal of patience. Inside the folded drone, tucked between two panels that had been bent back to create a small pocket, was a note. Handwritten on actual paper. Cruel held it under the light and read it twice. Then he read it to the war room, because Drath had asked him to report anything new, and this was certainly new. The note said, "We have been here for a while. It is good to finally meet properly." Below that was a small drawing, a hand open, palm outward, not a fist, not a weapon, a hand, open. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Raven said that folding the drone like that would have required tools and precision they could not explain given the time frame, because the drone had only been inside the ship's field range for approximately 4 minutes before being returned. Drath asked how a crew member would have had paper. No one had an answer for that. The question of how was becoming a recurring problem. Asa's report had landed on Drath's desk 2 hours earlier, and he had read it 3 times. He was still reading it, in the sense that certain parts of it kept floating back to the top of his thinking and refusing to leave. The part about the territorial claim. The part about the 42 misclassified infrastructure sites. The part near the end, written in Asa's characteristically flat style, where she noted that based on the coordinate data, the Dominion currently had 14 active military installations sitting inside human-claimed space without permission, and had been operating them there for between 8 and 30 years. He had asked her whether the humans knew. She had said she believed they did. She said the human territorial notification, filed 63 years ago, had included a full coordinate boundary map. Any of their navigational systems would have flagged Dominion installations as being inside the claimed boundary the moment they were established. The humans had known for decades that Voth military assets were sitting uninvited in their space. They had said nothing. Drath found that more unsettling than anything else in the report. Cruel had maintained the open channel to the human contact frequency throughout the night. At Drath's instruction, he had been carefully, diplomatically probing, asking questions that were not quite demands, gathering information without making commitments. The human on the other end of the channel, who had introduced himself simply as a communications liaison and declined to give further identification, answered every question with the same calm, unhurried tone, not evasive, not hostile. Simply very, very calm. Cruel had asked about the ship's mission. The liaison said it was a routine transit. Cruel had asked why the ship had not responded to the patrol hails in Corridor 9. The liaison said it had been monitoring all frequencies, but had not considered the patrol hails to be formal diplomatic communications requiring a response. Cruel had asked whether the ship was armed. The liaison had paused, a noticeable pause, longer than the others, and then said, "That is not really the right question to ask about this particular vessel." Cruel had not pushed further on that one. What Cruel had managed to establish, through careful conversation over several hours, was a rough picture of human space that did not match anything in the Dominion's records. The humans had not 3 or 4 colonies, as early projection models would have suggested. They had more than 300. They had a full administrative government with departments, agencies, and a functioning legal code. A legal code, Cruel noted to Drath, which was apparently where the formal territorial notification had come from. It had not been a political gesture. It had been a legal obligation that the humans fulfilled because their own laws required them to, regardless of whether anyone on the receiving end was paying attention. Drath's science team had been working through the night on the hull material question. They had taken the limited scanner data from Dren's patrol and Raven's blockade fleet and run it through every analytical model they had. Their conclusion, delivered by the lead physicist in a tone that suggested she would have preferred to deliver different news, was that the hull alloy contained three elements in a stable crystalline matrix that Voth materials science had classified as theoretically impossible to stabilize at room temperature. The theory had been established 2,000 years ago by one of the Dominion's most respected researchers. It had been in the foundational texts ever since. No one had seriously challenged it. The physicist said she was not saying the theory was wrong. She was saying the hull existed, and therefore something needed to be revisited. Drath asked how long it would take to develop a counter to a material like that. The physicist said she would need to understand how it was made first. She said that would take years at minimum, possibly decades, and required the assumption that they could replicate the process at all, given that they currently had no framework to explain it. It was at this point that Raven's updated sensor report came through. He had pushed the fleet's long-range arrays to maximum sensitivity and maximum range, sweeping the region behind the incoming vessel. He had found the 17 additional ships Asa had flagged. He had also found 14 more that were not in her report. 31 human vessels in total, currently inside Dominion sovereign space, moving slowly in a loose formation, following the first ship at a respectful distance. Not rushing. Not massing for attack, just there. The war room absorbed this information with the particular quality of silence that follows news which makes previous concerns feel small. Drath sat down. He did not sit down often in the war room. It was seen as a sign of informality at best and weakness at worst. He sat down anyway. He looked at the folded drone on the table, at the small paper note beside it, at the drawing of the open hand. He said quietly that he wanted a diplomat in this room, a senior one, not a junior intake officer, someone who knew how to have a conversation with a power that had been patient for 60 years and was apparently still being patient now, and figure out what it actually wanted. Cruel said he could make that call. Drath told him to make it fast. Galactic Empire panics. That can't be a human warship. Admiral Sovaharn arrived at the neutral station in a transport vessel that Raven's officers, reviewing the sensor data afterward, described in their logs as small, unremarkable, and probably older than expected. It had no visible weapons. Its drive signature was conventional. Its hull was standard registered alloy. It looked in every measurable way like a vessel that had seen better decades and was being kept alive through maintenance and stubbornness. Harn walked off it with one aide and a sealed personal carry case. No security detail. No ceremonial escort. The aide carried two things, a document satchel and a thermos. When the Voth station officers came to receive her with the formal 7-member greeting assembly that protocol required for visiting heads of state-level representatives, Harn shook hands with each of them, a gesture that confused several of them visibly, and asked if there was somewhere she could sit down. Drath watched this arrival on the feed and said nothing. Raven said the woman looked like someone's administrative supervisor. Asa, standing near the back of the room again, did not comment. She had spent the night reading every scrap of data available on human organizational culture, and she thought she understood what she was looking at. She just did not have a good way to explain it to Raven. The negotiation was held in a mid-tier conference room, not the grand diplomatic hall. Harn had declined it when offered, saying a smaller room would be more practical. Cruel represented the Dominion. 2 senior advisors flanked him. Harn sat across from them with her aide to her left and the thermos to her right. Cruel opened with the formal Voth diplomatic preamble. It was 11 minutes long and covered the history of the Dominion's interests in the region, the legal basis for its territorial claims, and the framework under which today's discussions would be conducted. It was, by Voth standards, quite brief. Harn waited for it to finish. Then she said, "Thank you, I have 4 things to ask for." Cruel blinked. In his experience, negotiations did not begin with a numbered list delivered in the first 30 seconds. Harn said, "Formal recognition of human sovereign territory as filed in the notification of 63 years ago, full coordinate boundaries as submitted. a permanent seat on the Galactic Council's primary chamber, standard trade access rights under the Common Framework Treaty, and a formal written apology, not a diplomatic expression of regret, but a direct apology for two communications sent in good faith and not answered. Cruel said the territorial recognition would need to be discussed given the scope of the claim. Harn slid a data pad across the table. It contained the full administrative census of human space, population figures by system, infrastructure indices, economic output, defense presence. It also contained on the final page a quietly formatted list of 43 Voth military installations currently operating inside the claimed boundary. Each one was listed with the date it was established, the number of personnel, and its current operational status. The list was accurate. Cruel recognized 3 of the installations immediately. Harn said the humans had no objection to those installations remaining. She said they would just need to be properly registered under the territorial framework, the way any responsible neighbor would handle a shared boundary. She said this as though it were a very simple and obvious thing. Cruel set the pad down and looked at it for a moment. Then he said he would need to consult with the Grand Warlord on the scope of the recognition. Harn said of course and poured something from her thermos into a small cup. She offered some to Cruel. He declined, uncertain what it was. She drank it slowly and waited. The consultation with Drath took 22 minutes. When Cruel came back, his posture had changed slightly. He said the Dominion was prepared to discuss a recognition framework, but suggested a phased approach, a provisional recognition covering a smaller initial zone, with the full claim subject to a joint survey. Harn said the claim was already surveyed. She said humans had been surveying it for 80 years. She said she could provide the full survey data, all of it, right now, and that it would save the Dominion approximately 15 years of work if they simply accepted it. She said this without any sharpness, just as a practical observation. Cruel said the Dominion's concern was the precedent of accepting a unilateral claim at this scale. Harn said the claim was not unilateral. She said it was filed legally according to the correct procedure through the correct channel 63 years ago. She said the Dominion had received it, logged it, and not responded. She said, with the same calm tone she had used for everything else, that silence was not the same as objection. There was a long pause. One of Cruel's advisors leaned over and spoke quietly in his ear. Cruel nodded slowly. He asked Harn what happened if the Dominion declined to recognize the claim. Harn said the claim would remain in place regardless. She said the humans were not asking permission. She said they were offering the Dominion the courtesy of a formal framework because having clear agreements made things easier for everyone. She picked up her cup and finished what was in it. Then she said, "We have been patient people, Ambassador. We would like to stay that way." The final agreement took 4 hours to work through. Every point Harn had listed was in it. The territorial recognition was full, not phased. The apology was written by Cruel personally, at Drath's instruction, and it used the word sorry twice, which Cruel found uncomfortable to write and Harn accepted without comment. At the end, she shook his hand again. He returned it this time without any visible confusion. As she walked back toward her unremarkable transport, Drath finally spoke to her directly over the station channel. His voice was controlled, but not quite as controlled as he would have wanted. He asked how long humans had been capable of what they were capable of. Harn paused at the boarding ramp. She thought about it genuinely, as though it was a question worth giving a real answer to. Then she said, "Long enough." She boarded. The transport undocked and moved away from the station at a perfectly ordinary speed. On the display in the war room, the 31 human vessels in Dominion space began, slowly and in good order, to turn around. Galactic Empire panics. That can't be a human warship. The news spread the way news of that kind always spreads, faster than anyone wanted, slower than anyone feared, and in a shape no one had predicted. Within 6 days of the agreement being signed, 17 other galactic powers had requested copies of the formal recognition document from the Dominion's public record archive. Some of them framed the request as routine diplomatic procedure. Some did not bother with framing. The Galactic Council's administrative office received a formal membership application from the Human Administrative Authority, properly formatted, correct procedure, all documentation attached, and logged it without flagging it, because no one on the intake team had been told to expect it, and the application was so completely in order that the automated system passed it straight through. Asa spent the week after the agreement writing her official intelligence report. It was the most important document of her career, and she knew it, which made the writing harder than usual. She had been writing intelligence reports for 19 years, and she was good at it: clean sentences, precise language, no editorializing. But this report kept pulling her toward something that was not quite analysis. It kept pulling her toward honesty. She wrote the factual sections first: the timeline, the survey failure, the misclassified infrastructure, the 2 unanswered transmissions, the territorial claim that had sat in a queue for 63 years. She wrote them plainly, without softening, because softening would not help anyone understand what had actually happened. Then she got to the conclusion, and she sat with the blank page for a while. She thought about the boarding drone, folded like origami and returned with a handwritten note inside. She thought about the physicist's face when she said 3 elements should not be stable and were. She thought about Harn, sitting in that conference room with her thermos, asking for 4 things in the first 30 seconds. She thought about the fact that the humans had known about 14 uninvited Voth military installations in their space for years and had never said a word, never made a complaint, never used it as leverage. Just waited, just kept building. She wrote, "We did not miss humanity because they were hidden. We missed them because we did not look. The lesson this situation teaches is not a lesson about humanity. It is a lesson about the assumptions that accumulate inside a power that has gone unchallenged for long enough to confuse familiarity with understanding." She paused, then she kept writing. The humans reached out twice. They filed their paperwork correctly. They followed every procedure that the galactic framework asks of a developing species seeking recognition. They were ignored, and they responded to that silence not with aggression, not with confrontation, but with continued development. They built what they needed. They mapped what they found. They registered their territory and waited for someone to respond. When response finally came, in the form of 47 warships and a demand, they did not escalate. They redirected. Every interaction in this situation on the human side was characterized by patience, precision, and the consistent choice to de-escalate rather than demonstrate capability by force. She stopped again. She looked at what she had written. She almost deleted the last paragraph. It read like admiration, and intelligence reports were not supposed to read like admiration. She left it in anyway. The final line she wrote was, "Going forward, the standard practice of leaving new contact files in dormant review without active monitoring should be reconsidered. Not because it creates a threat, but because it creates a silence, and silence, as this situation demonstrated clearly, is not the same as safety." She filed the report. It was read by 740 people in the first week, which was a record for an intelligence document of its type. Within a year, it was in the curriculum of the Dominion's Senior Officer Training Program. Within a generation, it was on the required reading list of every major galactic diplomatic academy, though by then most people who assigned it had never met Asa and did not know she had written it in a single sitting, in an empty archive room, still thinking about a drawing of an open hand. On the human warship, Captain Rail Dunmore stood at the forward observation window and watched the stars move. The ship was heading home. The mission had gone as planned, which was good, and without casualties, which was better. He had received a commendation from Admiral Harn, delivered over the command channel in her usual style, 2 sentences, both practical, no ceremony. He had filed it in the correct folder and moved on. A young crew member named Davy found him at the window during a quiet shift and asked whether they had ever really been in danger. Not just during this mission, but in general, out there, in space, surrounded by powers that had not known they existed until recently. Dunmore thought about it. He appreciated that Davy asked questions that deserved real answers and waited for them. He said, not during this mission, no. He said 100 years ago the answer would have been more complicated. He said 100 years from now the answer might be more complicated again, because that was the nature of a galaxy full of different kinds of people, and the work of staying safe was never fully finished. He said the goal was never to become something no one could threaten. He said the goal was to become something no one wanted to threaten. There was a difference, and it mattered. Davy thought about that for a while, then asked what the difference was exactly. Dunmore said one was about power and the other was about character. He said they had spent 100 years building both, and the job now was not to waste either one. The ship moved on through the dark, quiet, unhurried, heading home. Back on Earth, in a building old enough to have been built before the first human ship ever left the atmosphere, Admiral Harn sat at her desk at the end of a long day. She filed her mission report. In the field marked Outcome, she typed one word: sufficient. She closed the file, looked at the window and the ordinary sky beyond it, finished the last of something warm in a small cup, and went back to work. There was always more work. That had never bothered her. That was, in many ways, the whole point.